Thank you. It's really lovely to be here today. It's actually quite amazing that you're all here. It's not everyone's idea of a dream, but my idea of a dream. I feel like I should do a burlesque dance, but that's probably a bad idea. So I actually just want to start by thanking the WeShare team, because it's one thing to write ideas and come up with ideas, but what they've done to mobilize a movement around the world is truly remarkable. So my heartfelt thanks to you guys as well. What I'd like to talk about today is a question that is in my head at the moment, and I'm going to be honest that I don't have all the answers, but I'm going to share with you the journey that I'm on in the thinking, and I really hope over the next couple of days you push me and you ask me lots of questions. So I'm going to start with my belief. And my belief is that connected communities will be to the 21st century what the hierarchical institution was to the 20th century. And the question that I want to explore with you all today is whether this is really transformational or is it merely a trend. Now, like me, I'm sure many of you probably sense there is a deep connection underpinning companies such as Airbnb and Lyft, but also examples such as Bitcoin and Coursera. But when you're asked to articulate why or how, it's quite tricky to do so. And like me, some of you may have reservations whether the terms the sharing economy and collaborative consumption actually do justice to this family of ideas. And many of you may also be troubled that all these terms and definitions are being used interchangeably. Now, what I've realized over the last couple of years in trying to join the dots, not just in consumption behaviors, but across sectors, that the change happening is about more than the human behavior of sharing. And it's about more than the business model of shared assets. So I thought I'd start by sharing with you how I think about and define the collaborative economy. So in different areas of our lives, from the way we learn, to the way we bank, to the way we travel, consume, and produce goods and services, we are moving from top-down, centralized institutions that were controlled by the few towards distributed, connected communities that are controlled by the many. Now, this is a profound socioeconomic shift that is destabilizing institutional control as we know it and democratizing access to production, to consumption, to education, to finance, what I would consider the four pillars of the collaborative economy. So let me dive into some examples to really bring this to life. And where I want to go to first is actually the world of finance, because there's so much exciting disruption underway. So I find it interesting that the continent with the fastest uptake of peer-to-peer mobile money systems isn't America, isn't Asia or Europe, it's Africa. Now, yes, there's a fertile market because around 80% of the population is unbanked. But what's really interesting about countries such as Kenya is they are leapfrogging around the traditional banking men and the infrastructure as we know it. Now, to me, examples like M-Pesa are so important because what they show is that if we remove historical baggage, and we start from ground zero with no banking behaviors to unlearn, the system that makes the most intuitive sense to people and is best suited for the community is actually a peer-to-peer one, not a centralized institution. Now, M-Pesa is just one of thousands of examples around the world that represent what I believe is one of the most radical reconfigurations of banking and the very concept of money that we have seen in centuries. You can look at examples such as crowdfunding platforms such as Kickstarter, social lending systems such as Zopa or Lending Club, new payment platforms such as Balance, virtual currencies such as Bitcoin. What all these disruptions are doing is prizing open different parts of financial services that have long been dominated by the grip of big banks. And they're redistributing control over those parts towards distributed, connected communities. Now, what interests me, and I'm a little bit of a bumblebee or a polymath, I like to sort of dive into lots of different sectors and try to join the dots. And what I find fascinating is you can jump into an entirely different sector, like education, or what I prefer to think of as learning, and you will see a similar pattern of disruption underway. So let's just think of universities. So universities really started to spread around the world in the Middle Ages. And since that time, we've largely had to attend a physical institution to get a qualification. The buildings themselves became the names of the universities, Bristol University, Oxford University, MIT, and they became vessels that really contained learning. But they also restricted how many and who could teach and learn. But today, what's happening and is very exciting is examples such as Coursera, Stack Overflow, Khan Academy, General Assembly, Skillshare, and so I could go on, are all insurgents disrupting this pyramid power that runs rife in academia, in journals, in research, in funding, in tenure, and in the degrees themselves. You know, we talk about this age of connected communities, but one of the things that I'm very passionate about is that if we choose to do so, we can learn almost anything from anyone. And what attracted me to this subject in the first place is that technology is taking us back to old behaviors and our intrinsic instincts of how markets and society should actually function. Now, in this instance, what's fascinating is it's actually taking us back to the true meaning of the word university, which if you look at the Latin roots, means community of teachers. Now, I feel very lucky that I get to meet many of the entrepreneurs in this space, and I recently heard Professor Ning, who's a professor at Stanford and one of the co-founders of Coursera. And he said something that struck a really deep chord with me. He was talking about the first time he put his course on machine learning open for anyone in the world to take it for free. And 100,000 people signed up within a week. And he said that in that moment, he had an epiphany. And what he realized was that to teach his class, for people to physically have to attend Stanford, he would need to teach for 250 years. Now, it's just one anecdote that I hear of many that gets to a key benefit of the collaborative economy, and that's democratized access. And in this instance, we're talking about democratized access to learning and education. Now, what's amazing is if we look at an entirely different sector of accommodation or hospitality or travel, you see a very similar pattern of disruption emerging. It looks different in its manifestation, but if you look at the underpinnings, they're very similar. We're moving from a model of centralized physical ownership. And what companies like Airbnb and One Fine Stay and Couchsurfing are doing are unlocking new kinds of wealth by facilitating access to all these incredible people and spaces that were formerly underutilized. Now, I could spend the next 10 minutes presenting similar pictures with Etsy and Quirky for production. I could show you transport with Lyft and blah, 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 but you get the picture. So what's happening and why this is really exciting is that we are in a world that's shifting from institutional power to distributed power. This is really the force that is underneath the collaborative economy. And it's distributed power that is changing who we can trust and what we can access. So what interested me was who is vulnerable to this disruption? What are the sectors that are most likely to be transformed by this paradigm shift? So I basically looked at hundreds and hundreds of examples to try to identify common drivers. And the amazing thing is that 4 became clear after lots of research. So here are the 4 that I saw. The first is complex experiences. Now, these are experiences that are unnecessarily frustrating, time-consuming, or lack transparency. Now, I would put telcos and insurance at the top of the list. The second is broken trust. And this is sectors such as banking. And this is really where institutional trust or big trust is broken and peer trust is on the rise. The third is redundant intermediaries. Now, these are experiences or services or entire sectors where there are layers of middlemen or processes that can be easily removed. So this is areas like publishing and media. And the last is limited access. Now, these are experiences or opportunities that were previously out of the reach or inaccessible to many people. So having a bank account, having an education. If you are a product or service or a sector or an institution that checks one of these boxes, it's highly likely that you will be disrupted by the collaborative economy over the next decade. And I would actually put banking or financial services at the top of the list because it checks every single box. Now, as champions of this new economy, we have to be sensitive to the fact that even the idea of connected communities is a notion that is exciting to many people in this room, but it's frightening to most people. Now, the reason why it's frightening actually comes down to economics, because this pyramid that has made sense for so long as a way to organize business and society is being blown up. The transaction costs that made this model both efficient and logical in the industrial age have collapsed with the advent of network technologies. But for traditional organizations, it's really hard to accept this is the case because they have become perfectly adapted to a hierarchical environment. So for them to accept, let alone change to a collaborative economy that transforms how we think about supply and demand is extremely difficult. Now, what's interesting is you can look at over the last 20 years and you can see this happening, and media is a really good place to start. What the likes of Napster and YouTube, and more interestingly, SoundCloud showed and revealed that never could be reversed was that there was a different way to create, share, and buy music. I find it fascinating as a writer that's gone through the painful publishing process that 15 out of the top 100 bestsellers on the Kindle in 2012 in the UK alone were all self-published. And this is evidence that writers are successfully finding ways to cut out the publishing middlemen. When you consider that pharma companies spend billions of dollars on cancer research, and yet it was a 15-year-old American freshman that developed a sensor that could detect cancer in under 5 minutes and can be produced for as little as 3 cents, that's incredible. Now, what's happening is as we find more ways to see over the gates and get around the gatekeepers, the role that we can play in society fundamentally changes. Now, the end result of this is not about becoming collaborative consumers. It's not about becoming sharing evangelists. It's, for me, that we live in this unique moment in history where we have the opportunity to be empowered financiers, teachers, makers, creators, neighbors, citizens, and collaborators in ways on a scale never possible before. And that is incredible. So, to come back to my opening question, is this a transformation or is it a trend? Now, it can sound overly evangelical to call it a revolution, but if you actually look back in history, revolutions at their core involve a change in control and power over the things that people fundamentally need. Energy, transportation, water, goods and services. And that's exactly what's happening now. If you look back in history, most people feel empowered when they have access to knowledge and the ability to make choices. And that's what's happening now. So you may choose to keep your money in a big bank, but you now have the option to raise and invest capital in different ways, to borrow and lend money, and even to pay in ways that weren't previously available. I may choose to own a car, but I have the option to pay to access one when I need them, or just pay for the journey through services from Zipcar to BlaBlaCar. My children, who are currently aged 3, and my little Piccolo, who is 5 months, they may choose to go to a physical bricks and mortar institution, but it's more likely that they will curate a portfolio of learning experiences, irrespective of where they live in the world. So the way I see it is that the age of communities creates more choices because it democratizes the creation, the production, but also the distribution of goods and services. Now, just to wrap, I want to clarify something because sometimes when I give speeches, they're misinterpreted and then you sometimes live with that misinterpretation for the next 3 years. So one thing that I want to say is that I don't believe the success of the collaborative economy depends on the complete demise of institutions. You know, the world isn't a better place, in my opinion, if the likes of MIT, the New York Times, or say La Poste go away. You know, this disruption will cause institutions to rightfully collapse, but creating dichotomies between new and old and insurgents against incumbents are really unhelpful distractions from the work that we all need to do. And that is to let the collaborative economy evolve at a natural rate. And this is really difficult with the pressure of venture capitalists. The collaborative economy is a baby. It's not even a teenager yet. And the other work that we need to do is help institutions properly adapt to this collaborative environment. And that does not mean developing lip service initiatives. I am deeply concerned that we are heading towards the green movement and in danger of collaborative greenwashing. What we need to help institutions do is reinvent their structures, the structures that we are trying to bypass. Now, this will not be easy, and it's going to take time. And I find it amazing that Gandhi is so often quoted in these types of forums, but he said something about insurgent movements that is really a good description of sort of the growth and journey of the collaborative economy. He said, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then you win. Now, I have personally lived this journey. When my book came out, it sold 12 copies in the first 9 months, and my grandma bought 6. That, as my dear colleague Lauren will tell you, is not a joke. It is a fact. People laughed at this idea. They will continue to dismiss it as a trend. If I am asked the question one more time by a media reporter, is this because of the economic recession? My 3-year-old son could give the answer to that question. He has heard me say it so many times. And now we, of course, are seeing the fights with companies taking on lawsuits and lobbying government not to change regulation to help this economy survive and thrive. Now, this is, in my opinion, just a natural part of its evolution. But I have no doubt that it will be transformational. And the reason I believe it will be transformational is because once the genie of choice is released from the bottle of history, we've seen this happen before, that deep sense of empowerment is something that people can't take away from us. It's that feeling of empowerment that is truly irreversible. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rachel.
Thank you.
So, since there's going to be another session this afternoon about controversies of the sharing economy, which you should definitely visit, I just wanted to ask 1 or 2 more questions. Because since you work with a lot of organizations and corporations, I'm sure you've presented these ideas to them as well. And I'd really like to hear more about how do they react and how do you think you can really try to make traditional organizations more collaborative?
It's hard to give sort of a generalized answer because it's really different, but I'd actually sort of divide them into 3 categories. So the first, and is actually the most common, is the ostrich. So the reaction is, that's very nice, but you know what, we're too big for that, or it's never going to affect us. So they're like, we'll bury our heads in the sand, and it's not going to happen on our watch. The second are the fighters. So they actually believe they can fight this with scale, they can eat the startups up or they fight them with lawsuits. And then the third are the pioneers. And I've seen a change in the last 6 months about the conversations happening in a really positive way, that this isn't just about investment, this isn't about partnership. As I said, it's about a recognition that structurally they have a problem. This isn't the way institutions should run, this isn't the way people want to interact with their organization, but more importantly, it's not the best way to create value. And that for me is very exciting, that you see that shift happening and the conversation is really different.
That's really interesting. And so, since you give a lot of talks around the world to different types of audiences, I was wondering, so what was the most interesting audience that you presented these ideas to before? Because I'm sure, as you had said to me the other day, this is the first time you're actually speaking only to evangelists and experts, and I'm sure there's been
skeptics. Do you know the toughest audience that I don't know if any of you guys have seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off, one of my favorite movies, and he stands in front of the room and he's like, anyone, and anyone. It was high net worth financial managers, and it was total silence in the room. And I went very deep on financial disruption, and what amazed me was, and I don't even know how to say this in sort of a sensitive way, was their sheer ignorance. Like, you are in financial services, you work for one of the biggest banks in the world. How can you not know what Bitcoin is? Like, let's start with basic things. Like, how do you know what peer-to-peer lending is? And that is what I find frightening, but I also find exciting, because they think they almost have immunity from their ignorance, but that's what will allow the disruptors come in and really catch them off guard. And for me, those audiences are really difficult to speak to, because I want to help and inspire many people, but sometimes you just walk off stage and you bang your head against a brick wall and you go, that was just a waste of time.
So, as you said, the collaborative economy is really still a child. So what do you think it's going to look like in its adolescence or when it's grown up?
Pimply. No, I think it's, I was talking to a couple of people about this. Like, I am worried about it. Like, it's in a very fragile and vulnerable state. And one of the things I say to all of you in the room, definitions are really important. We may disagree on definitions, but it's not okay to be using all these terms interchangeably. We have to figure this out. Like, if we as a community can't figure this out, and then we're asking people all around the world to try and understand what it is, and we can't even agree on a name and a definition and what it's all about, that is a problem. So I think it's not about putting a tight box around this so that it can't be organic, but it is about us agreeing on some fundamental principles so that as it grows up, like kids, it's not completely lost, because it doesn't have some form of boundaries or some curfews, if you like, that help guide it in some kind of common direction.
Thank you.
Thank you.